money go? And the answer is that of the trillion that we spent, less than 2% went to economic development. 86% went for the US military. Another large chunk went for the Afghan military. Another large chunk went for drug interdiction and so on. And under $20 billion went for economic development over 20 years. Something like $10 per person for a billion a year, 20 million people, roughly speaking, or 2 billion a year. $1 billion a year for the population. Tiny investments. We wasted almost everything on a militarized approach. Why? Basically because the American military system does not care about the people that are at the receiving end of an intervention, and that has always been true. I'd say certainly from Vietnam onward. So I think that fundamentally we operated in Afghanistan with complete disdain of the Afghan people for 20 years. It was never, our leaders take great pride in promoting the idea we're not nation building, as if that would be the most horrible thing in the world. But what it means, as President Biden said it yesterday and has been repeated, and the Wall Street Journal chortled this today, we're not there because we care about other people. That would be a waste of our money. We're there because of us. And that's what our politicians need to tell us. And by the way, it's true. We never act as if we care about the other side. So it's not exactly a surprise that everything collapses suddenly the way that it does. And for many of us, my age and older, of course, we recall vividly Saigon. We recall vividly countless other examples of this. There's nothing surprising in this at all. And I can tell you, as one of our country's leading development practitioners, from the earliest days in 2002, 2003, I saw vividly how Washington could give a damn about any of this. And that was true certainly in George W. Bush's time, but it was basically true all the way from then till now. Nobody gives a damn about Afghanistan, and the Afghan people in some pretty basic fundamental way know it, get it, and this is why the collapse comes so easily and so quickly. If you'll permit me, let me just actually pull up, if I can get it. Just want to read you a couple of words from, I don't know if I can find it, in the Wall Street Journal. Just great pride in making clear, that Biden really blew it. And Biden doesn't understand. We're not there because of women and girls. We don't care about that. We don't care about nation building. We're there for our security. So let's get that straight. And Biden's really blown it. That view is really the Washington view. And so it could never work. It could never work. Not only because you put 98% of $1 trillion for the wrong purposes, but even the 2% wasn't out of any care or desire to improve the situation. I'm not saying for every single person, obviously, in every single project. I'm saying the mindset that guides our country. And that was true in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, you name it. We don't care as a country, and it shows. And so it's debacle after debacle after debacle. So otherwise, I don't have any opinions about this. But basically, peace action is completely correct. How stupid these policies are. I hate to say it, but it's pretty much bipartisan stupidity. There wasn't really, and by the way, this foreign policy of ours has been pretty much bipartisan stupidity, at least as long as I've been old enough to know, because it goes back to Lyndon Johnson after all. And it's mind-boggling how all of these misadventures end up in the situation that we're in right now so predictably. So anyway, I'll stop the rant, but that was what today's piece is about.
Thanks, Professor Sachs. Most enlightening and very incisive critique of the disaster of U.S. foreign policy in so many places. I can't help but map that onto China. I do want to come over to China, and we are, we say we're concerned about Taiwan. We say we're concerned about Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and so on. So, how do you see that lack of care that you've described in U.S. policy? How do you see that connecting to the emerging Cold War with China?
First of all of those who express a concern about these places, most of our politicians couldn't place them on a map and don't know what they're talking about. So this is the first point. What we're trying to do very consciously, very crudely and crassly is we're trying to corner and insult China at every turn by taking an extraordinarily important, dangerous, crucial, complex relationship of the two most powerful countries of the world and compressing it into emotive phrases. So every time a U.S. diplomat opens his or her mouth these days, the first words to a Chinese counterpart come out. So how's Xinjiang, Taiwan, and Hong Kong? Now, the reason why this is so absurd is that we have 1,000 issues that are of crucial global significance to discuss with China. And we want to make clear that what we want to discuss with China is China's sorest point, which is the sense of vulnerability of outsiders interfering and dividing China. And those three places are precisely China's biggest security concerns internally. And our idea of diplomacy is to put them the highest in discussion possible, when instead we should be discussing how to keep peace in the world, nuclear disarmament rather than a new arms race, which is happening right now, cyber safety and security, climate change, Afghanistan, and other global financial stability, ending COVID-19, getting vaccines to a desperately waiting world. There are 1,000 things we should be discussing with China, and we're not discussing any of them right now. In fact, the whole point of the foreign policy of this administration vis-a-vis China right now is to have no strategic dialogue, but only to issue a set of insults. That was true up until yesterday's debacle in Kabul. So Blinken today called Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, because now we're in desperate situation. So we want China's help to make sure that our personnel get out and to make sure that it isn't a worse disaster. So Blinken went begging today. But up until now, every word has been about American really meddling and provocations on China's sorest issues. Why are we raising Taiwan at all right now? That, by the way, is one of the 2 or 3 potential flashpoints for nuclear war, the way that we're playing with that. Just to be clear, it's extremely dangerous. That's number one. Why are we saying there is a genocide in Xinjiang, which is absolutely not true? There are human rights abuses, certainly, but a genocide is a complete PR provocation. So my point of all of this is, okay, let me turn it around. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because China's been too successful in the last 20 years, because U.S. policymakers decided about 5 years ago that we somehow have to contain China's development because China has become too successful in technological advance. And the word went out by Robert Blackwell at the Council on Foreign Relations, and then in official U.S. foreign policy statements, that we are changing to a kind of containment strategy. And then everything has been geared towards this new idea that China is a threat. We have to stop it from gaining technology, and we have to provoke China, and we have to, and Biden's idea, to supersede Trump's, is we have to do all the things Trump was doing, but we have to add allies around it. So Biden's enlightened view is we need a Cold War, but with allies. It's absolutely mind-bogglingly wrong. What we need right now is some cooperation, help the world to address really critical challenges, from pandemics to climate change, to economic emergencies, to unstable, war-ridden regions. That's what we need. We need cooperation between the 2 big countries. And this is my second rant, but I'll just tell you at a personal level, I've been going to China for 41 years. I've trained lots of Chinese students who are now officials throughout the government. I work with the Chinese academic colleagues on many issues very fruitfully for decades. And I find the approach that we're taking so wrong-headed, so incredibly misconceived, and so dangerous that I'm frankly shocked by it, because it's so stupid that I never imagined we'd come to it so quickly and easily. So sorry to mince words on that one too, but that is my main message.
Yeah, it's just stunning how fast they've been able to turn public opinion in the United States to see China as an adversary or a competitor or an enemy.
Competitor, yes, why not? On many things. An enemy, this is crazy and incredibly dangerous, because you make enemies, it becomes completely self-fulfilling. And that's what we're doing right now. And by the way, what we're really doing is trying to kill, we think we're going to kill China's progress by keeping advanced semiconductors away. And, indeed, they went out to try to kill Huawei a couple of years ago without any basis whatsoever, except repeating endlessly. it's a threat. It's a danger. We can't allow 5G of Huawei systems. And finally, they just cut off the line of advanced semiconductors last year, and it's really biting right now. But I'll make a prediction that China's going to be able to produce these semiconductors in a year or 2 or 3. We are spurring that advance quickly, and I think people should analogize this to the idea in 1945. The United States thought, well, we'll have the nuclear monopoly for the next generation at least. And it didn't take the Soviet Union more than 4 years to do what all of the US policymakers believed would be 15, 20, 25 years. And so we're playing a losing game the same way that it was obvious we were playing a losing game in Afghanistan. I have to tell you, I'm just not impressed with the intelligence. I mean, not only obviously the ill will, but I'm really deeply impressed by the ignorance in Washington. These people don't know what they're talking about. That's the bottom line.
Pretty scary. I wonder if you could try to turn it around and envision a productive relationship with China. Take climate change, take COVID-19, or take whatever specific issue you want to, and how should we be reaching out and collaborating? What do you envision?
China is, of course, a vast, important, complex country and society and civilization. And so we need a deep and knowledgeable and intensive and multifaceted relationship with China. We should be having regular meetings between US officials and Chinese officials, US academics and Chinese academics, cultural exchanges. China represents nearly 20% of the world population. It is one of the great civilizations of Earth's history, of humanity's history. So at a government level, we should be having absolutely normal, regular consultations. God forbid they should Zoom with each other every few days. You don't even have to travel anymore. And Zoom is a wonderful thing, actually. It's also nice to meet people, but it's in person. But Zoom is really nice that if the US and Chinese officials were actually talking about things, we'd get so far. But, when Biden came in, he gave the order. We are not going to have a strategic dialogue with China. And I think, I don't know exactly the motivations. I don't know how much the administration believes its own rhetoric. Somehow, I doubt it. I think perhaps their main preoccupation is to be called weak by right-wing Republicans, and that has been a standard modus operandi of Democrats for at least 60 years, and a very dangerous one, because the Democrats can go pretty far to the right, and as far as they go, the Republicans can go even farther to the right. And so you never can satisfy our yelping, barking, nasty, stupid, ignorant right wing in this country. But the Democrats try. So I'm not sure what it is that motivates the administration exactly, but they gave the instruction, we're not going to have a dialogue with China. Well, so your question is an excellent one. And the answer is all of those things. We should be having regular discussions on climate change, regular discussions on macroeconomics, regular discussions on COVID-19. By the way, if you have a look, while we have 200,000 cases a day of Delta right now, China has about 20, not 20,000, about 20. They had an outbreak that reached 17 provinces, and they got it under control, just as they had kept COVID under control for the past 2 years. We have had, I haven't looked at the most recent numbers, 630,000 deaths. I may be out of date. I should know today's number, but China has had about 4,000. And we've not had a serious discussion with them. How did you do that? What are you doing? I know we haven't, because I'm involved in this issue. And we're too stupid to discuss this with them. And when I write about it, I'm accused of listening to China's lies and blah, 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 because this country doesn't want to learn anything from anybody else. But China has really done an excellent job of containing this outbreak. And I'd like to understand it better, frankly. And our policymakers should understand it better. And we don't even try. So that's one. We should be sitting down with China and talking about the vaccines. And we should be helping China, by the way, to produce mRNA vaccines and sharing the information, because we want a world supply. And all our selfishness only means more variants that we're going to face and more of a pandemic. So again, we're so stupid, because this is all completely predictable. But we're not sitting down with China. We're in vaccine nationalism. Who can send to whom and when? By the way, we're barely supplying any vaccines to the rest of the world. And now with the new boosters, even less than we thought we were going to be providing. So we should be talking about that. It's incredible, by the way. I speak with my Chinese counterparts in development and in academia and in discussing with professionals about COVID. And the discussions are fruitful, important, interesting, different perspectives, good knowledge, many things to discuss. But, you know, that would be grown up.
Thank you. Well, if I could just close with this question, what can Americans that see a different perspective on this do to turn this dialogue around? I know we're not going to turn it around in a day, but where's the weak spot of the establishment's thought process, and where can we break through the clutter?
You know, we, as I'm sure that almost all of us, or all of us, vote Democratic and are friendly to this administration, as I am, by the way. Janet Yellen is, I think, the best Treasury Secretary we've had perhaps since Alexander Hamilton. She was my teacher of macroeconomics 48 years ago at Harvard. And I loved her then as a teacher and adore her and admire her. So we have a terrific Treasury Secretary. And what Biden is trying to do domestically with the new budget package that Bernie has just brought through the budget resolution, the $3.5 trillion, is really good. It's really important. So we have a very decent president, and we have an extremely important domestic agenda. And what we should do is help our friends understand you're on the wrong track. We don't want a Cold War. We're too unstable for a Cold War. You can't unite the country with the Cold War, which may be some of the thinking, by the way. You can't buy off the right wing with the Cold War.
I mean, just to interject, the liberals, like we have Ed Markey, we have Jim McGovern, they say that I'm not in favor of a Cold War. We are collaborating with China on climate, but they really aren't supporting it.
But by the way, what we can say to them, because they are our friends, and they do listen, and this is not because of the weight of our votes, it's because we're friends and they know it, it's not good enough to say, yeah, we're cooperating on climate, but on nothing else. It's a nonsense. I know it. I know it practically because there's work to be done. You can't just say, well, we're going to be cooperative on this, but we're going to be absolutely obnoxious on all the rest, and think that this is going to work. How clever is that?
Yeah,
we have to say to Markey and others, please, we need dialogue between the two countries, and we really need some global cooperation, not just on climate, though that's essential. We now obviously need it on Afghanistan. We need it on a whole host. We need it on COVID. We need normal relations. So stop putting Xinjiang, Taiwan, and Hong Kong at the center of our relations with China. They're somewhere on the list, maybe 90th. But what's really on our list is actually getting along so that we can solve crucial global problems together. And our friends need to hear that, and need to hear how completely unimpressive it is. Fellow Detroiters, very important.
Yeah. No, it's what I always say is we were canaries in the coal mine, because as children we got to see a cauldron of unsustainability. Let's talk a little bit about a number of things. Recently I saw you on the BBC talking about U.S.-China relations and took quite a bit of issue with how it was being framed. And I know you've written pieces. Project Syndicate in February was an extraordinary piece. We are turning a corner. Climate change is now in everyone's awareness. It can't be done without U.S. and Chinese collaboration. But I think let's talk about what you think is mischaracterized in the potential for U.S. and China to work together.
I think the basic point is we need a world in which cooperation is the dominant mode, whether that's to fight a pandemic or to fight climate change or to promote development. We can't do this in a divided world. And yet the tensions between the US and China have been rising, I think dangerously so, and I believe unnecessarily so. Mm-hmm. So that puts me a bit at odds with a lot of people in the United States, I would say most of the political class at this point, which takes it more or less for granted that China's an enemy. At best, will have harsh competitive relations, could get worse. I view all of that as wrong-spirited, wrong-headed, bad analysis, contrary to my own eyes and ears over the past 40 years. I've been going to China since 1981, typically a couple of times a year at a minimum, often several times a year. I've been all over China for decades, visiting remote areas, visiting Western China, Xinjiang, visiting Tibet, visiting Yunnan, visiting the coastal regions. And I do not see China as the enemy. I do not see China as the hostile force out to undermine U.S. well-being, which is actually even taken as an article of faith in our formal foreign policy documents, that China is out to undermine the United States and undermine the world. I think that this is a absolutely dangerous perspective. And by the way, if you believe it, the solution is sit down and negotiate and talk to the other side and solve problems, but not this kind of name calling, shouting through the press. Of course, it was even more insane when we had a president on Twitter, because we should not have politicians on Twitter. I'm not sure we should have Twitter at all, frankly, but we should not be doing foreign policy by tweets. We should be discussing, solving, brainstorming, presenting evidence, analyzing, but not just name calling, unilateral sanctions, attacking Chinese companies, warning, as our officials do everywhere in the world, don't you dare buy from Huawei. This will cause great damage to your relations with the United States. We're making threats all over the world that aim to really stop China's continued economic and technological development. I think it's disgusting and stupid, frankly. Those are the two adjectives that I would use. They do not comport with our well-being, with our national needs, and certainly not with the world's needs. That's what I called out. There aren't too many voices in the United States, unfortunately, calling for balance. We have both political parties that are anti-China. The Biden administration, just about every time it opens its mouth about China, is negative. Trump was crazy, so that was erratic. But Biden is not positive, not even neutral, and not so far saying, let's sit down and negotiate. In fact, the formal position is we're not going to have a strategic dialogue with China because we can't trust them, and we don't come out well in such strategic discussions. That's always a mistake. President Kennedy said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. That is the right position. And the position is sit down and talk, because so much is a misunderstanding, so much is biased thinking, so much is lack of perspective that unless we talk, we can't understand each other and we can't solve problems. The U.S. is the one that walked out of all the agreements, that doesn't abide by international agreements. We're the one that say, no, we're not going to be part of the International Criminal Court. We're the one that is not a party to Convention on Biological Diversity. We're not a signatory of the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There's so many parts of international law that we don't abide by, because a lot of United States action really is in the kind of Trump mindset. He put it, vulgarly and crudely, but it is no one's going to tell us what to do. Not the UN, not anyone else, as if law is some kind of punishment. Well, if you think that you're almighty, then you say, I don't want to be constrained by international law. And that has been a U.S. view of the U.S. right wing for a long time. But I think China actually wants international law, because they see that with international law, they wouldn't be held back. They would be responsible for their own development. I think that they are proud and believers that if they have an international rule of law, they're going to thrive. I think that's true too. It's a very talented nation, a great civilization, a great history, a lot of catching up to do because of the horrible period under European and Japanese imperial pressure and war. So China's catching up. Good. That's what I would like to see in the world. Countries overcoming a sorrowful past history that had a lot to do with the imperial dominance, which was the 19th and 20th century experience up until the mid-century of the 20th century after World War II. And that's not pernicious, that's not against U.S. interests, but it is pro-China interest. And my feeling is that's great. I want to see China develop. But American policymakers are, they're horrified. Oh, they'd be bigger than us. Well, yeah, they have 4 times the population. So, of course, China would be bigger than us. Oh, they would catch up in technology. Yeah, why not? Capable people investing heavily in research and development. The idea that that necessarily diminishes the United States is the kind of dangerous zero-sum thinking that will get us into a lot of trouble if we persist in that. And you're right, Rob, that the playbook is the Cold War. And there is a reading of the Cold War that, God, didn't we do great? We went toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union and they ended up collapsing. That's not how I read the Cold War. I read the Cold War as strongly unnecessary, extraordinarily dangerous, almost brought the world to annihilation. Annihilation, I'm not using the term casually. And something that we should be trying to avoid desperately, not to go back to that kind of danger which existed in that time.
I'll cite my acquaintance and recently partner in making a video, Daniel Ellsberg, whose book, The Doomsday Machine, talks about not just the bilateral conflict, but the burning of the upper atmosphere and the nuclear winter that can destroy, basically turn us into an ice age and destroy the food sources all over the earth. And
no one has been more vivid, more correct, more perspicacious than Daniel Ellsberg about these risks. That's a phenomenal book, The Doomsday Machine, but it's based on a phenomenal history. He was assigned, as you know very well, as a RAND officer after being a brilliant student in the first days of game theory at Harvard.
That's right.
He was assigned to look at nuclear policy of the United States, and he came to the horrifying realization that we had a finger on not only on the button, but on the button that would destroy the whole world. And that our doctrine was just about any accident could trigger a full-scale nuclear attack that by U.S. intelligence estimates would take out 700 million people or so, because it was going to be an attack to destroy the Soviet Union and China. Even if China wasn't directly involved, why not? We should target them as well. And then, as usual with the idiocy of our intelligence agencies, they didn't understand any of the atmospheric dynamics and the physics that would have ended our lives too.
I think that, there's a funny kind of blind spot that I saw you take on that BBC program, which is a lot of people in the United States say China is an authoritarian country and they don't treat people right. And in some regions, there's pretty good evidence for that. And you said, yeah, but what about how the United States treats people like African Americans and runs its prison systems and all the kind of things? That we're not in a place where, what you might call, we're going to go save the world unless we change how we practice what we preach ourselves. And I thought you're standing up to that mind frame really created quite a luster, quite a momentum in that conversation on BBC.
I have a foreign policy doctrine I call Jesus's foreign policy, because in the gospel, of course, Jesus famously says, "Why do you point to the mote in the other's eye when you have the beam in your own eye?" And what Jesus is doing in the Gospels is explaining basically how not to judge in the wrong way. And he is saying you better take care of your own base, your own ethics, in order to be able to be ethical with regard to others as well.
Yes.
And
yes.
we have, of course, a terrible blind spot. Here, the United States has walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement under Trump, walked out of the World Health Organization under Trump, walked out of UNESCO, cut aid, behaved atrociously, imposed unilateral sanctions. That's all abroad, not to mention all of the civil rights and human rights violations at home. And the first thing we do when the when the Biden administration comes in is point the finger at them, even in the shadow of the insurrection that we had on January 6th.
Yes.
Well, that's not how to behave. How we should behave anyway with a new administration is to meet and say, let's hope for good cooperation and that we can come to mutually beneficial understandings. That's how you greet someone anyway as a civilized human being. But in Alaska, we did just the opposite. We opened first words. What about Xinjiang? What about Hong Kong? What about Taiwan? Fighting words, the very first moment of interchange, as if the United States didn't have a lot of explaining to do about having a weird psychopathic president over the preceding 4 years, and can we pick up the pieces to get something normal going again? So
Yes.
this is my basic point, which is, we need to behave in a civilized way so that we can have a civilized relationship with other countries. And in a nuclear-armed world, it's insane to do otherwise.
I've seen you in the halls of the Vatican. I've seen the things you're exploring on what you might call framing the relationship between economic theory and the deeper moral teachings.
Well, I do think, as you know, what Pope Francis is telling us is extremely pertinent for us. He's written 2 wonderful encyclicals, one called Laudato Si, which is about climate change and about environmental destruction. And he says, do not destroy creation. We depend on it. We are a part of this world, and nature doesn't forgive. It will kick back very hard. And then he wrote a second encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, a brotherhood of all, or brotherhood and sisterhood of all, properly translated. And it's really a perfect accompaniment to the Sustainable Development encyclical, because it's about encounter with others. So it's framed around the Good Samaritan who helps the person in the road. And it's basically wisdom, pastoral wisdom of how to get along in this world. And I think that is part of ancient truths. Of course, the ancient world also had its nonstop wars and genocide, so it's not as if they knew necessarily better, but the teachings of how to get along we can remember as being extraordinarily important. And Pope Francis is basically saying right now, we need a world that recognizes its interdependence. We need, actually, he says, we need a plan for our common home. And he's absolutely right about that.
Yeah. Let me come back a little bit to the dynamic between the United States and China. I've worked quite a bit in China starting around 1990 and ran the Quantum Emerging Growth Fund. Non-Japan Asia portfolio was my focus. I've been going there for many years, and many of the trusted people, I've never met Xi Jinping, but many of the high-level people I have met repeatedly. And they say one thing to me after Donald Trump came into office. We had China 2025, and there are concerns about property rights or access to our financial markets, and we understand all those things. But what we don't understand is why we are being blamed for the American leadership, not just under Trump, but before that, engaging in globalization when we're a very large country that had, at the starting gate, a per capita income roughly 1/40th of the American per capita income. And the Americans did nothing for their own people in the transformation, in the adjustment assistance, in the retraining and reallocation. And the winners got their taxes cut, got to keep their money offshore, exacerbated class divisions. And we were powerless to do anything about that, and now we're being blamed for that. And I think I didn't have anything to say, but
Yeah,
they are.
it's an interesting point. You know, I think broadly speaking, the notion in any event that China is somehow a source of major U.S. social ills is trumped up, if I could put it that way, wildly. But I would say more than that. There is a point which is true, that as trade with China expanded, there were places in the United States, in the Midwest, I think predominantly, that did lose jobs to the import competition from China. And it's the second lesson of trade, because I used to teach trade at Harvard. It's the second lesson of trade theory, that trade expands the pie. That's the first lesson. But the second lesson is it doesn't necessarily distribute it the way that you would want it distributed. There can be absolute losers and more than fair winners. Mm-hmm. But the theorem that Paul Samuelson, the great economist, proved about trade already about 80 years ago is that the winners can compensate the losers. So that everybody can be made better off. That's what you teach in trade theory, that look, the pie is going to grow, but the slices of the pie could really leave some people short. But it's possible that those that are getting the huge slice of the pie, they could share something so everybody's slice is bigger than it was without trade. Well, we didn't have that at all, because our society, our politics, our political economy since Reagan was so anti-social democratic, so anti-sharing, that losers were losers in the moral way, not only in the financial way. Hey, if you lost, tough for you. You must be a loser. And Trump was, of course, the most extreme weird expositor, because for him, there are killers and there are losers. So when Trump came in, the only thing he really did was cut taxes for the rich even more. But you know what he claimed that he was going to do was reverse the trade with China, and that would bring back some jobs. And I think that was a part of his success in 2016 elections, because he carried by a sliver those swing industrial states in the Midwest, and that's what put him into the White House. The truth is, that's not where the jobs were really lost. The jobs were lost to automation, to technology, and so forth. Those are not jobs coming back. So it was all based on, a phony economic or false economic perception. But even if it were true, the right way to handle an issue of inequality is through U.S. redistribution rather than closing down global trade. You close down global trade, everybody loses. You redistribute, then the winners help to compensate the losers. But that's a mindset that America doesn't have, because we're lacking that discourse in American political economy that winners should help losers. In the American mindset, and it's a pretty complicated cultural mindset. It goes back to John Locke. It goes back to the Puritans. It goes back to the prosperity gospel. It goes back to the racism. The mindset is, if you lose, it's pretty tough, but you're probably a loser. And if you're depending on somebody else's help, you're really a loser. So that's an American view, which is quite distinctive in our culture, really pernicious, but it feeds into the China question because the Chinese leaders can't really understand, well, if you have some people that need help, why aren't you giving them help? Why are you blaming us? Just like you said.
Yeah.
And they're right. The truth is that cooperation, that's been a mutual gain, but not an equally shared gain. And China doesn't face the same thing vis-a-vis Europe, because in Europe, I would say the social democratic ethos is pretty pervasive. It's not the American ethos that if you lose, that's your tough luck. It is much more somebody will come to help you pick up, and you certainly won't lose your health benefits because those are for everybody.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You're bringing back all kinds of readings. As I mentioned, I was an undergraduate at MIT, and I took history of thought with Paul Samuelson. And,
Okay, there you go. Yep.
He wrote
and
papers.
he made a lot of that economic thought.
Yeah, but he made a lot of what I'll put late papers that were like asterisks, because he could see what was happening, particularly as U.S. and Japan pressures and the pressures on the auto industry were emerging. Right after he got the Nobel Prize, I think he was intended to give a speech on international trade, and it had to be postponed till the next year. But he gave a speech that was about that we do not compensate the losers, and it could exacerbate social unsustainability, as we now call it. He also wrote about the implications in a world of changing technology, that the winners get what you might call the cash to go invest in technology, and the dynamics can create a place where in the first allocation you might have been better off, but in the long run you might have been a loser if you didn't do the proper transformational power.
He was very unhappy that there was a kind of grandiosity and simplification by the free trade advocates in the U.S., including academics, that said free trade is great, leave it at that. And Samuelson in 1941 wrote wrote a paper that became known as the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. And the Stolper-Samuelson theorem showed how you could have absolute losers from trade in a context where trade was making a bigger economy, just what I was mentioning earlier. So he was the formal author of the models that displayed why you need internal redistribution. His answer was, don't stop trade, but make sure that you take care of everybody. And a lot of free trade proponents failed to add the proviso, take care of everybody, and then the trade opponents failed to understand the benefits of trade. So a lot of people that I'm politically sympathetic with, say on the left or center left, are anti-trade, but they don't understand that's not really the right way to proceed. We wanted an integrated, cooperative world, but we want to take care of everybody. So it's more open trade plus social democracy. That's the Scandinavian vision of this. I think it works the best.
Samuelson says, why is it harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle? There must be a reason, and I suppose that reason is better known to Europeans who have had to put up with American tourists for a century than to Americans themselves. Affluence breeds self-confidence, even to the point of arrogance. As Samuel Butler said, there is always a certain lack of amiability about the go-getter. And I had
my God, who could write like Samuelson, by the way?
Oh, man, I know. And I had an experience that resonates with everything that you've been saying about U.S. versus Europe. There was a gentleman named Leif Pogrodsky who ran the consulate for Sweden.
I know Leif very well.
And I've known Leif because I was involved in the Swedish devaluation when I worked for Soros in 1992. And he and I have worked together ever since. And Leif brought me to a meeting where a bunch of Swedish economists said they wanted INET to consider something. That forever the European model had been considered sclerotic, and the American model of deregulating the supply side to reallocate factors of production was viewed as dynamic and the growth model that should be emulated. And they said to me, given automation and given globalization, and given that Donald Trump is now president, this was 2019 January, what we see is that a Swede says, I love the robots, because it increases that production possibility frontier, the envelope of possibility, and I am confident that I will get retraining, my health insurance, my pension, and my children's education, so I want to be part of the dynamic. In America, you're breaking down. That was the punchline of what Leif wanted me to hear.
But by the way, the Swedish model was really always based on that idea that we shouldn't resist actually productivity increases, new technologies, international trade, because everyone will get taken care of. So that bigger pie will end up more vacation time, more leisure time, better health care. So they've been on that theme for a long time. And it's really true that today you get the anti-trade or anti-technology reaction if you don't have a system that shares, because then it really is a fight of losers against winners, and you just end up with social struggle.
Well, and you going back to the echoes of our time in Detroit, I've seen an awful lot of what I'll call otherness. A man named Arjun Jayadav and I wrote a paper once where we looked at regional variations in economic activity, and particularly places that were being plundered by austere state and local budgets, automation, or import penetration that was new. It was a time of adjustment. And what we saw was survey evidence indicating that these shocks created despair. And what we saw in lockstep was indicators of racial animosity went up with economic despair. So we created what you might call an otherness that promoted a dysfunction, which Peter Temin has written about in his book on the vanishing middle class, where we stopped the rungs in the ladder of the education system because we became so divisive about not educating those others. And so I went back to the Swedes and I said, well, maybe it's because you're more racial, ethnically homogeneous that you can do this and take care of each other. We have a very big challenge to overcome based on what I'll call the scar tissue of my formative years in Detroit and what I see going around the nation. You know what his answer to me was? You might be right, but if you don't overcome that scar tissue, the prevailing model will be China, because they know how to use the state to make these transfers.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I'm just saying.
And of course, it was a Swede, Gunnar Myrdal, who came to the U.S. in 1946.
That's right.
To tell us about the racial challenge that needed to be overcome in his book, The American Dilemma.
Yes.
And they're still trying to teach us about that.
Last thought, going back to this question of how U.S. elites and governance neglected to support American people in the onset of globalization, development of China, and automation. We have a situation now where I believe that Trump capitalized on that woundedness. But a lot of the things that we've been fighting with China about have to do with intellectual property rights, pharmaceutical rights, access to financial markets. These are all the high margin services now, picking a fight. These are companies who've probably been violated because they did a foreign direct investment and then they watched factories like theirs being replicated rather than expanding the scale, which they thought was the original promise. This is some of the angst about the China 2025 program. But it looks to me like the wealthy and the powerful now have joined both parties, the demonization of China, and perhaps the fear in the Biden administration of not doing that, which you and I both think is ominous. But the fear of not doing that is that what you might call the general population, which was wounded by globalization, has been taught to blame the Chinese rather than their own leaders. And they fear losing control. The Biden administration fears losing control of the House, the Senate, and perhaps the White House. How do we overcome that? How do we overcome the false consciousness of the general public about who's responsible that my Chinese ally pointed out when he said the Chinese were powerless to create the transformation within America?
There are, of course, many, many deep currents of American politics, and the China issue is one of many. And to understand any of our dynamics domestically, we have to look not only at foreign policy issues, but even more at racial divides and at wealth divides. So the questions of America's plutocracy, the questions of America's tradition of white supremacy, and the questions of America's tradition of foreign policy exceptionalism are all on the line right now. And so there's a lot of angst, anxiety, confusion, claims, and counterclaims. When it comes to China, it is certainly the trigger of the current phase of relations was China's breakthrough to becoming a high-tech, innovative country. And it was specifically the Made in China 2025 program, which was a pretty brash statement. I think, from a tactical point of view, I would not have suggested that China put it the way it did, but basically China said, okay, here are the 10 top technologies, we're going to dominate them. If they had said, we're going to advance in them, it would have been tactically smarter, less hubris. Of course, we have our own hubris. We need to come in first. We're going to win the race to the moon and so forth. But the gist of it is straightforward, in my view, which is that China said, we're going to move to the forefront of key technologies, most of them, semiconductors, advanced transport, precision medicine, precision agriculture, renewable energy, and so robotics and so on. Good list, smart policies, the right kind of innovation-led development that China needed. Now, that scared the wits out of American policymakers, first of all, and it also violated the implicit idea that American policymakers naively had about China, because it wasn't that America said, well, they're going to become like us. What American policymakers believed is China would become wealthier and it would develop, but under the wing of the United States. We would be clearly in the technological lead. We would be organizing global principles, and there would be a place for China, just like there would be a place for the whole world in development. So it was an America-led mindset, and it was used to be called the flying geese model of development that Japan propounded. We'd be the goose in front. Right. We would always be in the lead technology, and then China started saying, "No, we're gonna innovate," and that is really the trigger to all of this now, which is hell no, and you're cheating, and we've got to stop you, and this is a grave threat, and of course it also gets implicated in the integration of AI and semiconductors and everything else into the military sphere, into the security sphere, into the surveillance and cyber warfare sphere. So that's a lot of the problem, which is that our semi-crazed policymakers view all of this not just in the lens of economic competition, but in the lens of military dominance, which is, again, a little bit boring, a little bit predictable, and very dangerous to have a mindset the way that our policymakers do. That's what's going on right now. This is a war of technology, they think. Now, as an economist, it's all mind-boggling to me because in economic think, technology is the way we do things, the way we solve problems, the way we overcome climate change, the way we stop poverty, the way we treat people for health. It's not a general saying, my God, if we don't have the best autonomous weapons that can murder other people with AI, we've got to stop China. So the idea that it's all a technology battle is wrong, dangerous, zero sum at best, but negative sum in reality. But that's really what we're up against right now. And that's why the real battle for the moment is America trying to stop the advanced microchips from going to China. I'm almost sure, I'm not absolutely sure because I'm not at the cutting edge knowledge of this, but my guess is that this is a 2 or 3 year workaround hindrance for China, not some existential threat. China now has thousands of semiconductor companies that are being absolutely showered with cash to figure out how to make small nanometer microcircuits. And they're good and they're smart. And my guess is they'll figure out how to do it. And then they'll get on with making low-cost phones again and 5G systems and so on. But it would be so much better if we were recognizing that this doesn't have to be a war to the death, and God forbid that it becomes one, but rather an opportunity actually to decarbonize our energy systems, solve problems of transport and mobility, help poor people get educations. If we thought about it in those terms, we'd come to a very, very different perspective and a new kind of foreign policy.